Hello, I'm here. I am really here, even though it's five past five. Uh, my son's just been out for a walk this afternoon with a friend and came back just about 4 minutes ago, going, "Oh, it was so great! And we played cops and robbers, and we built a den, and he had walkie talkies, and it was really cool, and we had code names for the different things, and I didn't have the heart to say, Christopher, shh, Christopher, I need to go, Christopher, I need to go. Anyway, he had a lovely time, thanks to his friend's mum, which is really nice because these things, we haven't had much of this kind of thing recently, so it's quite special, especially since he's in a year that can't go back to school, so they don't get to see their friends at all. So anyway, here we are. It's Monday. We're back for the penultimate reading in this series. So we've got chapter 15 of The Demon in the Embers today, which is the penultimate chapter of the book, the chapter before the last chapter, but one. And as you will know if you watched the stream I did on Friday, I think, I've decided that I'm not going to carry on with the series at the moment. I'm going to pause doing this for a bit in order to try and make a bit more time to write, because otherwise I just feel frustrated that the new book doesn't get written. I mean, it is getting written. I've started doing it again, but I'm not brilliant at 6:45 in the morning, I have to admit. And I'm not brilliant at about 10:15 at night, which are the other times that I do it. So there is a bit of a window here where I could do it while my very dear husband cooks the supper. So I'm going to snatch that time to do it. And if any of you like what I write, then it is for you, I suppose, because it's another book. It isn't in this series. This series has 3 more, which I may come back to record at some point in the future. I might well do this again if I need a break from writing, when I have more time to be writing. But as I said the other day, I don't need a break from writing at the moment. I need all the time I can get, which is already not very much. So there we are. But we're going to finish this book. So we're on the second to last chapter. Joe's got back into Lucy's world, and it is just after the fire. So London is this amazing wasteland. I've tried to imagine it. I wish I could see it. It must have been remarkable. Ash and charred timbers, and really strangely these black stalks sticking up here and there, where any house that had a chimney, and of course by this point that was quite a lot of them, most of them I would think, the chimneys were made of brick, because we already knew that brick didn't burn, and so that's what we built our chimneys out of. And a chimney stack goes up the middle of the house, pretty much. So there are these blackened stacks, brick stacks, all over the place in this pale grey wasteland of ash. And the smell, I mean, after a house fire, the smell is really pungent, and it stays, and it stays. And Samuel Pepys, in his diary, when he wrote in February 1667, so that's 5 months after the fire, after the whole of the winter, he said that the ground was still hot in places. So it's been amazingly hot, and it would still be very hot at the point that Joe's there. But by now it's burned out, it's not still raging, and now there is this huge nothingness. And in the nothingness, climbing over the rubble and the wasteland and the ash, Joe sees Lucy. And she seems to be in a bit of a state. And she sees him, he calls to her, and she doesn't hear, and then he calls again. Joe, is that you? Her voice quavered. Is that really you? Okay, chapter 15. In less than a minute, Joe had covered the remaining distance between them. As he reached Lucy, he hesitated for a split second. Then he put his arms around her. She hugged him so tightly he could hardly breathe. Joe, she wept into his shoulder, you're alive. You've survived. I thought you'd been killed. Joe's heart thundered. I thought the same about you, he managed to say. He felt choked. He unwound his arms and stepped back. It was awful, wasn't it? He bit his lip. What a stupid thing to say. But what was the point in describing the horror? Lucy knew perfectly well what he meant. She nodded numbly. Did Peter and your parents... He didn't know how to finish the question. I don't know. She clasped her hands together. He was struck by how small and fragile she looked. I haven't seen them since I last saw you. I've come back to see if there's anything left. I thought if there was, if our house had survived, but without any of the old streets and buildings. She waved a hand helplessly. I can't believe it. I've lived here all my life, and I'm completely lost. What happened to you all meeting outside the city walls? Lucy blinked and swallowed. There was such a crush, not just on this side, but outside the gate too. You know what it was like near our house. The people who fell. She broke off. Joe nodded. She took a deep breath and went on. Outside it was hardly any better. Before I knew what had happened, I'd been swept up in the crowd. I don't really know how. But I ended up at Moorfields. There's a huge encampment up there. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve. The frilled cuff was filthy. Her cheeks and forehead were smudged with soot, Joe noticed, and her hair was knotted and grey from the ash, her white cap gone. I've been wandering over the fields for the last 3 days, hoping to find them, she said, but there are hundreds, maybe even thousands of people sheltering up there. It's hopeless. Did you try Bethnal Green? Joe asked. Wasn't that where your family was going? I don't know where it is, she sniffed. I've no idea how long it would take me to walk there. I suppose if the house is gone... Again her voice trailed off. Joe put his hand tentatively on her arm. I know where Threadneedle Street is, he said. That's where I was when I reappeared. Some of the houses are still standing, though I don't know if yours is one of them. I'll take you there. He turned around, back the way he'd come, and gulped. From this direction there was a kind of ring of buildings around the ash, marking the edge of the fire's progress. He'd headed out across the wasteland without a backward look, and it wasn't obvious at all now which was Lucy's street. He cleared his throat and set out towards the point he thought he'd come from. Hopefully Lucy would recognise where she was when they got close, even if he didn't find the right street straight away. She was quiet as they crossed the ruins together. Joe stole a look at her every now and then. He wanted to speak, but didn't know what to say. She had seemed glad to see him, but now her expression had closed up again. He wished he could do something to take her sadness away. For his own part, he was overjoyed to find that she'd survived. But her happiness depended on finding her home still standing and her family alive. Abruptly she stopped. She grabbed his arm. What is it? What's the matter? She pointed to a figure crouching down a short way away. It was the boy Joe had seen fiddling with something on the ground. Now he was looking at a stick he held in his hand. It was wound round with rope at one end. Flames danced over the surface of the rope. Tobias, Joe gasped. I passed him earlier, but I didn't recognise him. He looks so scruffy, and he's cut off his hair. Lucy nodded. I couldn't think what he was doing, Joe whispered. He must have been trying to light that torch. But whatever for? They looked at each other. Fear sparked in the pit of Joe's stomach. The plans, he murmured. He's going to see if your house is still there and look for his plans. Did you manage to get them when you went back? She shook her head. The crowd was too tight. I never made it to the house. What shall we do? Her voice rose. If the house didn't burn down, he's bound to find them. The sand barrel is almost the only thing left. Could we go round a different way and try and get there first? Joe suggested. But even as he said it, he knew it was nonsense. There was no different way across the open ground. In any case, it was already too late. Tobias stood up and looked straight at them. The muscles of his face went rigid. Then he screeched, "Demon!" Jo felt Lucy shrink away, but Tobias wasn't looking at her. He stalked across the embers, his eyes locked on Jo's face. "Demon!" He screamed again, brandishing his flaming torch. Behind the glow, he was pale with rage. "You said you were my guardian angel, but you're a servant of the devil." Jo steeled himself. He would not be terrorized by this boy, despite the fire he carried. "If I'm a demon," he called back, "why am I here now?" "To turn me from the path of righteousness." Tobias glowered. "You stopped me once, now you want to stop me a second time." "You're surely not going to burn down Whitehall and Westminster, are you?" Jo asked, incredulous. "Not after this." He made himself take his eyes off Tobias, as though he didn't need to watch him, and looked out over the smoking city. When he looked back, Tobias was several steps closer. His mouth was twisted into a grim smile. "Maybe not," he said, "though it saddens me to see such a wicked and lustful king escape unharmed." Jo watched him advancing. His mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. "The thing is," Tobias snarled, "that same king will have me killed if my plans are discovered. I never should have written them down, but they were so complicated, the tides, the timings, exactly where and what hour each element should be executed. Nothing had been left to chance." Jo detected a note of pride beneath Tobias's fury. "It would have succeeded too, if it hadn't been for you." Tobias's voice rose to a screech. "And then you vanished, and the plans vanished with you." He was only a few steps away now. Jo felt the heat of the torch on his face. He stood his ground. His heart was pounding. "I wasn't the only person who knew there were plans," he said as steadily as he could. "What about the boys who were supposed to help you, the ones who ran off?" Tobias stopped. There was a fractional pause. Then he growled, "They wouldn't have dared. And they couldn't have found them. They'd never set foot in the house before, whereas you—" He thrust the torch towards Jo. "You'd already ingratiated yourself with the master and mistress, already imposed your lies on them." "No!" Lucy shouted. Jo turned in surprise. "He didn't!" Her eyes were ablaze with indignation. "The lies were mine, not his. And my parents liked him because he's friendly and decent and appreciative, which is more than you've ever been." The full glare of Tobias's loathing swung round onto her. "Defending the devil, Mistress Lucy," he snapped. "Lucifer keeps a special place in hell for sinners like you. Next you'll say that your demon friend didn't steal my plans." Jo kept his gaze fixed on Tobias's face, determined not to look at Lucy. But she must have given herself away, because the older boy suddenly screeched at her. "It was you! The demon sent you to find them. I should have known." He lunged, but not at Lucy, at Jo. With the torch held high in one hand, he brought his other fist up beneath Jo's chin. The impact jarred through Jo's skull. He staggered backwards and fell. Pinpricks of light danced in front of his eyes. Something sharp dug into his back. He reeled with the shock. The blow had come completely out of the blue. He hadn't even seen Tobias look at him. Something warm trickled out of his mouth. He put his hand to his lips. Blood. Tobias had seized Lucy by the hair and was dragging her away. "You poison the household against me," he screamed at her. "All those lies you told me. I'll make you pay for that." Lucy struggled wildly, writhing and kicking out, but Tobias held her tightly at arm's length. "We'll see if your family was lucky," he said. "If your house is still standing, you can start by showing me where you hid my papers." He gave her hair a wrench with his wrist. Lucy cried out. Joe scrabbled to his feet. His head was still spinning and he felt sick, but there was no hissing in his ears. He stumbled to catch Tobias up. The older boy whirled round. "Stay back, demon," he commanded, brandishing the flaming torch. "We all know what fire can do. Her hair would go up in seconds. In fact, shall we try it and see?" He moved the flame towards Lucy's temple. "No!" Joe shouted. "Don't hurt her!" He backed away, holding up both hands. There had to be a way of rescuing Lucy from Tobias, but he stood no chance of winning unarmed against the other boy's firebrand. Tobias snorted, but he let the torch fall to his side. He jerked Lucy round once more and set off across the ruins, hauling her along beside him. Joe followed, flinching when Lucy whimpered. For the first time he wondered if it might actually be best if Lucy's house had burnt down. Then the plans would have gone, and Tobias wouldn't be able to get them back. But of course that wouldn't help. If the plans had been destroyed, Tobias could deny that he'd ever plotted to kill the king. He could even do it again if he chose. Lucy would have risked everything for nothing. No, it would be better if the house still stood, but Lucy would have to convince Tobias that the plans had gone with her family's possessions. Could she do that? Could she keep up the lie if Tobias threatened her? Joe wasn't sure. Nobody challenged Tobias as he forced Lucy across the wasteland towards what remained of Threadneedle Street. Not one of the people they passed even looked up. Were they blind? Or had they seen and lost so much that their senses were deadened? Tobias and Lucy had disappeared by the time Joe reached the first of the houses. He'd watched them closely enough to know which street they had taken, but they were now nowhere to be seen. They must have gone into Lucy's house. Anxiety mounted inside Joe. How could he tell which one it was? Then he remembered following Tobias across Jorvik one snowy night. It was strange to think of it in the glowing ruins of another world, but he remembered that he and Lucy hadn't known for certain that Tobias was there until they saw his tracks in the snow. There should be tracks here too, not on the road where the ash had been trodden down, but through the drift along the edge. He made himself walk slowly so that he could scrutinize the ground in front of each building. It was almost impossible to concentrate when every nerve and sinew in him was screeching at him to hurry. Hurry, hurry. The first building was no more than half a house. A four-poster bed teetered on the edge of what remained of the upstairs floor. Its canopy hung in charred shreds. Further along was the first whole house, followed by the second. The plaster between the beams was as black as the beams themselves, but the ash was undisturbed at the foot of both houses. Nobody had returned here yet. But at the door to the third house the ash had been trampled. Joe's pulse quickened. This was exactly what he'd hoped to find, yet he was afraid too. For a second he stood looking up at the front of the house. It must be Lucy's house, surely. But he couldn't see Tobias's flame through either of the downstairs windows. He prayed Tobias hadn't already dragged Lucy into the kitchen. Just then he saw a movement through the sitting-room window. He rubbed one of the diamond panes with his cuff and peered in. The room was in deep gloom. He screwed up his eyes, trying to make out what the movement might have been. His pulse was throbbing. Perhaps he'd imagined it. There was nothing at all in the room as far as he could see. Then the movement came again, a shadow darting along the floor beside the wall. Joe cleaned a second pane of glass and put his face right up to it this time, shielding his eyes. In the back corner, a dark bundle was hunched on the ground. In a flash, he knew what it was. His heartbeat stilled for a moment, and his mind ran clear. He saw with absolute certainty how he could use this. This could be his weapon. Very quietly, he let himself in through the front door. The door to the dining room stood open, but he could hear Tobias in the room opposite the kitchen. Joe winced at the menace in Tobias's voice. He stepped into the sitting room and shut the door quickly behind him. "Solomon," he whispered. "It's me, Joe." He crept across the room towards the dark shape. "You can come out of your corner," he murmured. "I won't hurt you." The monkey sat motionless. Joe held his breath. If Solomon took fright or screeched, Tobias would know at once that he was in the house. A few feet away, he stopped and stretched out his hand. "It's okay," he whispered. "The fire's gone. It's all right now." He waited for Solomon to bare his teeth or bound away, but the monkey did neither. Joe inched closer. The animal's eyes were huge in his tiny face. He'd been so mischievous before, Joe had forgotten how sweet he could look. He reached out further, expecting any moment to be bitten or scratched. But his fingers touched soft fur. Beneath them he felt the flutter of a heartbeat as rapid as a bird's wing. To his astonishment, a tiny hand closed around his thumb. Joe lifted Solomon into his arms. The monkey clung to him. As he tiptoed to the door, he mumbled soothing noises into Solomon's fur. His own heart was thudding again. He hoped the sound of it wouldn't frighten the monkey. On the other hand, it might be better if Solomon was afraid. He was so meek now, Joe feared his plan might not work. From the hallway came thumping and scuffling noises, and then a muffled curse. Joe heard Lucy cry out again. He tensed, waiting for the door to open. But Tobias dragged Lucy into the dining room. Joe knew he had no more than a few seconds before Tobias came across the hall. He took a deep breath. All he had on his side was the element of surprise and the hope that the monkey would remember Tobias. Silently, he pulled the sitting room door open. "Ready?" he murmured to Solomon. "Right then, this is it." He charged across the hall into the room opposite. "Let her go!" he yelled. Lucy screamed, Tobias froze, and Solomon leapt, just as Joe had hoped. It couldn't have taken even half a second, but Joe felt as though he watched in slow motion as the monkey sailed through the air. Solomon's arms and legs were outstretched like a skydiver in free fall. Then he struck Tobias hard, full in the face. At once he wrapped his limbs around Tobias's head and began to bite him. Tobias dropped the torch to grapple with Solomon. Lucy tore herself free and staggered to the other side of the room, where she collapsed, shaking. Joe ran to her. "Are you all right?" He bent down to help her up, but she was waving her arms, shouting incoherently. He looked over his shoulder. The end of the room was on fire. Joe spun round. Tobias must have kicked the torch as he wrestled with Solomon. It had rolled into the palliasses that were still on the floor. Already, knee-high flames were crackling across the straw. "No!" Joe cried. "The house can't burn down now. It survived the fire." He struggled out of his coat and threw it over the flames. They flared out around it. He hadn't spread it wide enough. He gritted his teeth and picked it up by the edge, intending to fling it down again, but lifting it caused a draught that fanned the fire. More orange tongues sprang up, strong and hungry. He let the coat fall straight away. The fire began to lick at the cuffs. He scoured the room for something else, anything, but there was nothing. In desperation, he began to stamp at the edge of the blaze. Scraps of the palliasse covers came away, turned black and died. Vivid stems of straw dulled and went out. He stamped further in. Ash crumbled beneath his foot, but the fire was still growing faster than he could stifle it. Something snagged his shoe. He shook it. Part of the cover had got caught around the toe. A fresh thread of smoke rose into the air. The shoe was smouldering. He shook his foot harder. He couldn't get the shoe free. In a moment it would catch fire. He had to get it off. Balancing on his other foot, he stooped and grasped the heel. The shoe slipped off easily, but he couldn't free it from the tangle. He would have to drop it and let it burn. The heat of the fire beat against his face. He shied away. To his horror, he felt himself lose his balance. He tried to hop on his remaining shoe. The heel turned over. He started to fall. There was nothing for it. He put his stockinged foot down in the burning palliasse. There was a smell of scorching hair as the stocking caught light. Then the flames were racing across his foot. For a moment, the pain was so shocking he couldn't move. With an immense effort, he stumbled clear of the fire and crumpled down on the floor. He clasped his foot with both hands, trying vainly to deaden the pain. There was a sudden gust of wind. The fire roared. A figure burst into the room. But you'll have to come back tomorrow to see who it is, who has arrived. So we've got the last chapter tomorrow. The last chapter tomorrow. But fancy using a monkey as a weapon. I love that idea. It's almost worth having a monkey just to be able to do it. Except that I think Solomon was probably a lot more trouble than he was worth. Anyway, last chapter, last reading tomorrow. I hope to see you then.